The fall that shook the silence. The sun was merciless that afternoon on the California set of The Last Bloom. Cameras had been rolling non-stop for 8 hours straight under hot lights and rising pressure. The crew was exhausted. Makeup artists rushed with brushes. Assistants darted between trailers. But Sandra Bullock, ever the professional, ever the graceful presence, never once complained. She showed up with a smile, gave her best in every take, and lifted everyone around her like sunlight through storm clouds. But that day, something was different. Keanu Reeves had noticed it from the moment she stepped onto set. She moved slower. Her eyes looked glassier than usual, as if there were a film of something unsaid between her thoughts and the world. Her smile was still there, but it was distant, like it had been borrowed from another time. He'd known Sandra for decades, more than co-stars, more than friends. A quiet, enduring connection bound them, the kind that didn't need explaining. He respected her space, but he never ignored the signs. Between scenes, Keanu gently stepped beside her trailer and tapped. She opened the door with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Hey," she said softly, "you good?" he asked, voice low and calm. "Just tired," she replied quickly, as if swatting the question away. But he saw the way she leaned on the doorframe just a second longer than usual. Saw the way her fingers trembled slightly as she reached for the water bottle. Still, he nodded and let it go, for now. Then, during the third take of the final scene, an intense emotional sequence where her character walks through fire to find the truth, Sandra took one step forward, faltered, and collapsed. The camera kept rolling for a moment longer, frozen in disbelief. Then chaos erupted. Someone screamed. The director shouted, "Cut!" The medic rushed forward, but Keanu, he was already there. He ran faster than anyone expected, his feet barely touching the ground. He dropped to his knees beside her, lifting her head with incredible care, like she was made of something precious. Her face was pale, her breathing shallow. Her lips were slightly blue. "Sandra?" he whispered urgently, brushing her hair back. "Hey, come on! Look at me." She didn't respond. Keanu's heart slammed against his ribs. A strange kind of silence fell inside him, the kind that comes before a storm you cannot stop. The crew backed away, unsure of what to do. Some were crying. Others stood frozen. Keanu held her close, shielded her from the cameras and noise. "Call an ambulance!" He roared, not out of panic but out of love wrapped in steel. His voice cut through the noise like a sword. Someone obeyed immediately. Then, with her head still resting in his lap, she stirred, just a little. Her lips moved. "Keanu," she whispered, her eyes fluttering open. His throat tightened. "I'm here," he said. "You're okay. You're gonna be okay." She nodded weakly and lost consciousness again. That night, news broke everywhere. Sandra Bullock collapses on set. Keanu Reeves' response melts hearts worldwide. But no headline captured what really happened in those moments. How he never let go of her hand. How he stayed in the ambulance. How he refused to leave the hospital waiting room, even when doctors assured him she'd be okay. Because this wasn't about the cameras, or fame, or the story. It was about something rare, something real, and that was just the beginning. The room where time stood still. The waiting room smelled like overbrewed coffee and quiet despair. Keanu sat slouched in the far corner, one arm resting on the armrest, the other gripping a lukewarm cup he hadn't touched in over an hour. The nurses at the reception desk had offered him a private lounge, but he refused. He didn't want separation. He didn't want silence. He wanted to be close, to the hallway, to the heartbeat monitors he imagined beeping behind the closed ICU door, to her. The hospital lights buzzed faintly above, humming over the chaos of the past few hours, but nothing could drown out the echo of Sandra's voice whispering his name just before she lost consciousness again. It looped in his mind like a heartbeat, like a question, like something unfinished. Doctors had walked in and out with careful words and neutral expressions. Exhaustion, they said. Dehydration. Stress-induced syncope. Vitamin deficiency. were running tests just to be sure. But nothing they said truly mattered to Keanu. What mattered was that Sandra had collapsed in his arms, had looked at him with eyes that seemed to be saying goodbye, even if her lips never formed the words. It haunted him. It terrified him. Because somewhere deep down, he'd always carried a quiet truth, that he cared for her far more than anyone ever knew. He leaned back against the sterile wall and closed his eyes. Memories came uninvited. A balcony in Venice during a film festival, years ago, where they laughed about nothing until the sun came up. The way she used to tuck her hair behind her ears when she was nervous, even off camera. The quiet strength in her voice when she consoled him after his sister passed. And how, after Speed wrapped all those years ago, she'd written him a letter he never had the courage to answer. Not fully. The hallway door creaked. A nurse stepped out, her voice soft but clear. "Mr. Reeves?" He was on his feet before she could say more. "She's awake. You can see her now." He didn't speak. He simply nodded, placed the untouched coffee on the nearest table, and followed her down the corridor. The room was dim, the curtains drawn. A monitor blinked softly beside the bed, its rhythmic beeping steady and slow. Sandra lay still, her head slightly turned toward the window. Her eyes were open but distant, like she was still somewhere else, somewhere far from this room, from this reality. Keanu stepped inside, each footstep deliberate. He didn't want to startle her. He didn't even know what to say. For all the roles he'd played, for all the scripts he'd memorized, this moment was unscripted and sacred. She turned her head slowly, her gaze catching his like it always did, without effort, without warning. "You stayed," she said, voice fragile, raw. He managed a smile, though his chest felt tight. "Of course I did. Where else would I be?" A silence settled over the room. Not awkward, just heavy, full. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to scare everyone." Keanu walked closer and pulled a chair beside her bed. "You scared more than everyone," he said quietly. "You scared me." Sandra turned her face slightly toward the ceiling, blinking back something he couldn't see. "It was stupid. I kept ignoring the signs. I thought I could push through it. But my body, it had other plans." "What is it, Sandy?" he asked. "What's really going on?" She hesitated. The silence between them was the kind that only existed between people who had known each other long enough to fear saying too much and regret saying too little. Her fingers fidgeted with the edge of the hospital sheet. Then, finally, she spoke. "My mom used to say, if you ignore your soul long enough, it'll sit you down whether you like it or not." She looked at him again, her eyes glassy. "Keanu, I've been sitting on pain for so long. Loss, grief, guilt. I never processed anything. I just kept moving. Film after film. Day after day. Smile after smile. But inside..." She trailed off. He reached out and gently placed his hand over hers. No words, just warmth. Just presence. "You don't have to carry all of that alone," he said after a while. "You never did. You just never let anyone close enough to help." "I let you close," she said. That hit him harder than she probably meant it to. His hand didn't move. "I know," he replied softly. A silence again, but this time it was tender. She took a breath. "There's something else." He tensed slightly, sensing the shift. "When I passed out, I heard a voice. Yours, but I wasn't here. I was somewhere dark, and your voice brought me back." Her throat tightened. It was like an anchor. And in that moment, I realized something I've been hiding from for years. Keanu leaned in just slightly, his eyes never leaving hers. She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. That night, as doctors checked her vitals and nurses came and went, Keanu stayed. He sat in that chair like a silent sentinel, watching over her not because it was required, but because it was right. Because for the first time in years, they were both still enough to see what had always been there. Outside the hospital window, the city went on with its noise and neon. But inside that room, something old and quiet and true was beginning to stir again, something that neither fame nor time nor fear had been able to extinguish. And somewhere deep inside both of them, a question was rising gently into the space between them. What would happen if we stopped running? The diagnosis, the letter, and the promise. The hospital room had changed. Not in layout or lighting, but in energy. 2 days had passed since Sandra's collapse, and while her physical condition was stabilizing, something much deeper was shifting beneath the surface, something she and Keanu could both feel, though neither dared to name. The third morning dawned gray and slow. Rain slid down the window in long, unhurried streams, as though even the sky had chosen to rest beside her. She sat upright now, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, staring outside in silence as Keanu quietly entered the room, carrying 2 coffees and a paper bag with her favorite blueberry muffin, something he remembered from a road trip they'd taken to Santa Fe 12 years ago, when filming had been paused and they'd decided to get lost for a weekend with no destination. She looked up when he walked in, her expression soft. "You remember everything, don't you?" He smiled slightly, handing her the cup. "Only the things that matter." That line sat between them for a moment like a ripple in still water. They sat together for a while without speaking, the way people do when they don't need to fill the silence with anything artificial. Then Sandra finally spoke. "They gave me the results this morning." Keanu turned, his heart tightening. And she hesitated, then met his gaze directly. "It's my heart. Mild arrhythmia. Not life-threatening, but it's been worsened by exhaustion and stress. I've been ignoring symptoms for over a year, pretending I could outwork it." She took a deep breath. "But the truth is, I wasn't just running from doctors. I was running from myself." Keanu's hand tightened around the cup. "Why didn't you say anything?" She shook her head slowly, her voice lower now. "Because if I slowed down long enough to admit something was wrong, I was afraid I'd have to look at all the things I've buried." He studied her face. No makeup now, no bright lights, no performance, just Sandra, real and stripped of all illusion. "Then let's look," he said quietly. Together, her eyes welled up. And in that moment, she reached for something hidden in the drawer beside her bed. A folded letter, aged at the edges with handwriting he instantly recognized. His own. She handed it to him wordlessly. He unfolded it slowly, his fingers trembling more than he expected. The memory came rushing back. He'd written this letter over a decade ago, after a long night of shooting, in the quiet of a hotel room with too many emotions and too little courage to say them aloud. The letter had never been sent. He thought it was lost, but somehow she had it. He read it again now, silently. "Sandra, if I had one honest moment, I'd tell you this. Your presence has always been my shelter. You are chaos and calm in one breath, and I think I've been orbiting you for longer than I realized. If life weren't so complicated, if we weren't so careful, I'd tell you that I miss you even when you're standing right next to me. But maybe I'm too much of a coward to say that in person." He folded it back slowly, hands still but heart racing. "You found it," he whispered. She nodded. "You left it in the back of my script binder on the last day of filming." "I wasn't supposed to find it, was I?" "No," he said, then smiled faintly. "But maybe you were." They sat still, both quietly overcome. For years, timing had kept them apart. Their lives were rivers running side by side, close but never quite touching. There were always reasons not to go there. Other relationships, busy schedules, the weight of what-ifs. But now, in the aftermath of her collapse, in the presence of bare truth and hospital honesty, all the noise had faded. What remained was just them, the way they really were, the way they always had been. "I wanted to answer it," she said after a long pause. 1,000 times. But I didn't know what to say. I was scared that if I opened that door, I'd never be able to close it again. Keanu reached out and gently placed his hand over hers. "Then maybe it's time we stop closing doors we were meant to walk through." She looked at him for a long time. Really looked. Not as the world saw him, not as a co-star, not as a cultural icon, but as a man. As the man who showed up, stayed, waited, remembered, and never pushed. And something broke inside her, quietly and beautifully. She wept, not because she was sad, not because she was afraid, but because she had finally stopped holding it in. Keanu moved beside her, held her in silence, his arms a quiet cathedral around her grief. She leaned into him, letting herself be vulnerable in a way she hadn't allowed in years. It was not romantic yet, not defined by anything other than trust and deep, earned affection. But it was real. It was rare. The hospital faded away for a moment. There were no cameras, no scripts, no publicists or premieres. Just a woman who had carried the world too long and a man who had been waiting to carry it with her. Later that evening, after her rest, Keanu wheeled her out onto the hospital terrace. The rain had stopped, and the city lights blinked awake like fireflies below. She sipped water slowly, wrapped in a coat he brought from home. The sky stretched wide above them, and for the first time in weeks, she didn't feel like she had to keep pretending to be strong. "You remember that Santa Fe trip?" she asked suddenly. He smiled. "Best 2 days of my life." "Mine too," she said, her voice light. "I think that was the last time I really breathed." Keanu looked at her and said nothing. But the way he looked at her said everything. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe love, in its quietest form, had been there all along, waiting, not for a grand gesture, but for a single moment of truth. And maybe, just maybe, that moment had finally come. When grief was no longer a secret. The night air was cool but not cold, scented faintly with jasmine from the garden below the terrace, and a soft breeze stirred Sandra's hair as she leaned back in her wheelchair. Keanu sat beside her, elbows resting on his knees, his gaze cast far out over the city like he was reading something in the distance no one else could see. The terrace lights flickered once, then steadied, casting a soft glow on them both, as if even the world around them had paused, unwilling to interrupt the silence. It was the kind of stillness that only arrives when two people have finally stopped pretending, when the facade has dropped and all that remains is the raw, human ache to be known and accepted, completely. Sandra broke the silence first, her voice low but sure. "You ever wonder how many parts of ourselves we hide just to keep moving?" Keanu didn't answer right away. He rubbed his hands together slowly, as if warming thoughts that had been cold too long. "I think we're taught to wear grief like a coat in summer," he said. "To pretend we're not sweating under the weight of it. To smile so the world stays comfortable." He looked at her then, and there was no distance in his eyes. But the body remembers. The soul remembers. She turned to him fully, her eyes sharper now, not in strength but in presence. "I never asked what you've been carrying," she said. "And I should have." Keanu leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose. "My mother passed quietly," he began, "just over a year ago. I didn't tell anyone, not really. Didn't hold a press conference, didn't write a tribute online. I just—" He looked at his hands. "I went to the cemetery by myself. Sat there for hours. Said everything I hadn't said. And then I got back on set 2 days later like nothing happened." Sandra didn't speak. She just reached over, gently rested her hand on top of his, anchoring him in place. "She used to call me every Sunday," he continued, "just to ask if I'd eaten, just to hear my voice. And now, every Sunday feels like I'm listening for something that won't come again." The weight of his words sat between them like the ocean. Vast, unspoken, deep. Sandra's voice softened. "I remember after my mother died, I went on a press tour, smiled, signed autographs, did interviews. But inside it felt like someone had turned all the colors gray." Keanu nodded slowly, his expression unreadable but his eyes wet. "And I kept asking myself," she went on, "what's the point of success, of fame, if the people you want to share it with are gone?" A hush fell over them again, but this one wasn't heavy. It was sacred, the kind of silence that follows truth. Not because there's nothing to say, but because everything that needed to be said had been laid bare. He looked at her with a softness that was almost painful. Maybe the point isn't sharing success. Maybe the point is being there when the lights are off, when the crowd is gone. Maybe it's moments like this, she nodded, biting her lower lip. Then maybe I've missed the point for a long time. No, he said quietly. I think maybe this is the point, she smiled through her tears. And it was different from the smile on red carpets, different from the carefully composed expressions on magazine covers. This smile was a woman finally releasing the performance of strength. It was the first time in a long time that she wasn't acting. After a long pause, Keanu stood. "Come on, where? I want to show you something." He helped her up gently, her feet barely touching the ground as he guided her slowly down the hall, arm wrapped around her shoulders for balance. The hospital wing was dim, and the nurses at the desk smiled softly but said nothing, perhaps sensing something intimate was unfolding that didn't need explanation. Down the corridor, past the ICU doors, they entered the meditation room, a small, overlooked sanctuary filled with candles, a skylight, and a wall of names etched in glass. Names of patients, names of those remembered. Keanu guided her to a bench and sat beside her. "My sister used to come here," he said, "when she was sick. This was the only room where she said she felt at peace." Sandra looked around slowly, the soft candlelight dancing in her eyes. "It's beautiful. She told me once," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "that if I ever felt lost, I should come here and sit until I could hear the truth again." Sandra closed her eyes. For a moment, neither of them moved. It was as if the entire hospital disappeared, and all that remained was two souls trying to remember who they were before the world told them who to be. "I think I forgot how to breathe for myself," she said after a while. "I've spent so long being who everyone needed me to be, strong, unshakable, composed, that I stopped asking what I needed." Keanu turned to her, gently tilting her chin with his hand so she looked at him. "Then ask now," he said. "Right here, right now. What do you need?" Her lips trembled and her voice cracked under the weight of her honesty. "I need rest. I need to feel safe. I need someone to not expect me to be perfect." Keanu nodded slowly. "Then rest. Be imperfect. I'm here." That night they didn't return to the hospital room. They stayed in that sanctuary long after the candles burned low, speaking softly, sometimes not speaking at all, sharing stories, memories, regrets. It wasn't a romance, not yet. But it was love, the real kind. The kind that sits quietly beside you while you unravel, and waits patiently for your pieces to remember how they fit back together. Later, as Sandra dozed lightly on the bench, her head resting on Keanu's shoulder, he stared up at the glass ceiling, where the stars blinked through a thin film of city cloud. He whispered so softly, only the candles could hear, "I don't want to lose you too," because now he knew. Her fall had not just awakened a fear, it had awakened a truth, and he would not let it slip away this time. The life she chose to leave, and the one she could finally begin. The following morning arrived slowly, as if the sun itself was reluctant to disturb the fragile peace that had settled in the hospital's meditation room. Sandra opened her eyes to the soft hum of the city waking up beyond the stained glass window. Her head was resting against Keanu's shoulder, her body wrapped in the warmth of a borrowed blanket, and for a rare, sacred moment, she didn't feel like the woman the world expected her to be. She didn't feel like an actress, a producer, or an icon. She just felt human, seen, held, alive. Keanu stirred beside her, blinking away sleep, his arms still gently around her shoulders as if he'd been protecting something all night without letting it go. When their eyes met, they didn't need to speak. There was no awkwardness. No need to explain why they'd stayed there instead of returning to the hospital room. Some moments belong to no one else. Some decisions are made by the soul long before the body moves. But Sandra knew the peace wouldn't last unless she made it last. By mid-morning, she was back in her hospital room. The doctors reviewed her progress, optimistic about her recovery. Her heart condition was manageable. Her vitals had stabilized. She could go home within 2 days if she chose. But that wasn't the decision she was wrestling with. No, the real decision was about her life. The real choice was about what kind of woman she wanted to be from this moment forward, and what kind of world she would allow herself to live in. Later that afternoon, Keanu left briefly to pick up some things. Sandra, now alone for the first time in hours, stared at the wall opposite her bed. It held a single framed print, an abstract painting of a forest, fog-wrapped and silent. Something about it spoke to her. The stillness, the loneliness, the hidden beauty. It reminded her of the inside of her mind, full of trees and paths she hadn't walked in years, and fog she had learned to live inside without even noticing. She reached for her journal, the same one she'd carried through sets and interviews for the last 5 years, its leather cover worn, its pages rarely touched. Today, she opened to a fresh sheet, put the pen to the paper, and began to write. Not for a character, not for a script, not for the world, for herself. I've lived a life of applause, of endless movement, of proving that I can. But I no longer want to prove. I want to pause. I want to breathe without needing a camera to capture it, a headline to frame it, or a team to brand it. I want to walk away from a world that taught me silence is weakness. Keanu saw me when I couldn't see myself, and in that silence I remembered who I was before the noise. I'm not broken. I'm just done pretending I'm not tired, and I'm finally ready to build something real. When Keanu returned, he found her dressed in a soft sweater, her hair loosely tied, her hospital wristband still intact but her face different. There was something quiet in her eyes now. Resolved, awake. She looked at him and said the words he had not expected to hear, yet had always hoped for. I'm not going back. He paused. To the set? She shook her head. To that life. The one where I run until I break. The one where I smile so no one worries. I've been performing longer than I've been acting. And it ends here. He didn't argue. He didn't advise. He just walked closer and said softly, Then let's build something else. She exhaled like a weight had left her chest. I want quiet mornings. I want long walks. I want to cook again, badly, and burn toast without anyone writing about it. I want to see where my heart leads when I'm not pushing it to the edge. Keanu reached into the bag he'd brought and pulled out something small, a weathered envelope, sealed in wax with her name in his handwriting. She furrowed her brow, confused. What is this? He offered a shy smile. I was going to give this to you years ago when we wrapped the lake house, but I chickened out. Thought maybe I'd missed my window. I found it again last week right before we started this new film. Something told me I should bring it. Her fingers trembled as she broke the seal. Inside was a photo, a candid one from that forgotten Santa Fe weekend. The two of them on the hood of an old Jeep, laughing uncontrollably, waned in their hair, the sunset behind them. On the back of the photo, in simple ink, were the words, We were already everything we needed. We just didn't know it yet. Her eyes blurred as she clutched the photo to her chest. Why didn't you show this to me before? She asked, voice cracking, because I didn't think I was enough for you back then, and I didn't want to make your life messier than it already was. She looked at him, stunned. You've always been the calm in my chaos. You weren't the mess, Keanu. You were the reason I kept going. The air between them felt different now, full, electric, sacred. She reached for his hand, not with hesitation, but with intention. Fingers interlaced. I'm not asking for fireworks or labels, she said softly. I just want real. I want peace, and I want it with someone who doesn't need me to pretend anymore. He smiled, the kind of smile that comes from a place beyond time. Then let's begin. And just like that, they did, not with a kiss, not with a declaration, not with anything Hollywood would script, but with a quiet pact made between two people who had wandered far, fallen hard, and found, through collapse and stillness, that sometimes the truest beginnings start after everything else has fallen away. That evening, Sandra discharged herself early. No press conference, no entourage, just Keanu beside her, one hand on her back, the other carrying her bag, as they walked out of the hospital into the fading light of a day that no one but them would remember. And somewhere deep inside her chest, beyond the tests, beyond the fatigue, beyond the labels, her heart beat steady. For the first time in years, it beat for something new. The quiet life they chose, and the millions who never forgot. Weeks had passed since Sandra Bullock and Keanu Reeves left the hospital under a faded sky and fading expectations. No paparazzi had caught them. No breaking headlines followed. It was almost as if the world had allowed them a moment of grace, one that neither of them took for granted. They disappeared not into isolation, but into a life most would call ordinary, and they, at last, could call their own. The ocean town they chose wasn't famous, nor particularly glamorous. It was tucked along a quiet coastline in Northern California, a place where seagulls were louder than sirens, and the sun broke through fog like a soft, patient visitor. Sandra rented a small cottage with blue shutters and a winding stone path surrounded by overgrown lavender. Keanu lived 3 doors down in a weathered gray house with a rusting mailbox and a garden he hadn't tended in years, until now. They didn't live together. Not yet. But every morning, he showed up at her door with fresh coffee. Sometimes 2 books tucked under his arm, sometimes just silence. And every evening she walked to his place with leftovers in hand, her hair messy, her soul light. They cooked, burned half of it, laughed, cleaned dishes in bare feet, and watched the stars fall behind hills no one photographed. There were no scripts to memorize, no trailers to park, no lights but the moon, and no lines to deliver except those whispered between 2 hearts that no longer needed to act. The world hadn't forgotten them, of course. They were still Sandra Bullock and Keanu Reeves, after all, 2 names etched into Hollywood's history. But something subtle shifted when news of her collapse broke weeks earlier. It wasn't just about headlines or public concern. It was about the glimpse the world saw. The moment when Keanu dropped everything to kneel beside her, the way his hand never left hers, the way he refused to leave that hospital until she opened her eyes. That moment captured in a single photo by a nurse who never sold it, but posted it with one simple caption: "This is what love looks like when no one is watching." The image spread like wildfire, not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. No grand gesture, no red carpet kiss. Just a man beside a woman he refused to let fall alone. People around the world saw something in that moment that reminded them of what they longed for. Not fame, but presence. Not perfection, but care. The photo inspired letters, messages, videos, stories of people who left toxic jobs, who called their estranged fathers, who apologized to old friends, who chose to rest, because of one moment that reminded them of what truly matters. Meanwhile, Sandra planted tomatoes. Badly. She didn't know when they were ripe. She watered them too much. But Keanu showed her how day by day, and she laughed in a way she hadn't since childhood, wild, unfiltered, full of air. Sometimes he'd show up mid-morning with a guitar and sit on her porch, strumming gently while she painted in silence. She wasn't painting for an exhibit. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She painted because color returned to her fingers, and because her hands needed to speak without words. One rainy afternoon, as they sat watching the storm roll in from his porch, Sandra turned to him and asked a question that had been brewing quietly. "Why didn't you ever ask me to run away with you?" He didn't smile. He didn't joke. He looked at her with stillness. "Because you weren't ready," he said, "and if I had been." He reached out, brushing a strand of wet hair from her cheek. "I would have walked with you anywhere. But I never wanted to be the reason you left yourself behind." She leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. "I didn't just leave the industry," she whispered. "I left the version of me that needed everyone's approval to feel worthy." Keanu didn't reply. He just wrapped his arm around her, held her there as thunder rolled gently overhead. They never made a formal announcement. No press releases. No wedding photos or magazine spreads. What they had was quiet, deep, unshakable. Some called it friendship. Others speculated romance, but only they knew what it truly was. A commitment not to each other, but to being real in each other's presence. That was the most radical love either of them had ever known. Months passed. One day, Sandra received a letter. Not fan mail, not a studio request. It was from a woman in rural Texas, a mother of 3, a former nurse. Her daughter had seen the photo of Sandra and Keanu in the hospital and asked, "Mama, is that what love looks like?" The woman wrote, "Thank you for showing my little girl that love doesn't have to shout. It can just stay." Sandra cried quietly on her porch reading that letter. She handed it to Keanu later that evening. He read it, folded it slowly, and said only one thing. Maybe we were never meant to entertain the world. Maybe we were meant to remind it, and that's exactly what they became. Not actors, not celebrities, but reminders of what still matters when everything else falls away, and though their names would always be remembered. For the films, the awards, the legacy. They would remember each other not for who they played, but for who they became. After the fall, after the silence, after the cameras stopped. Two people who chose peace, and in doing so, quietly touched millions who needed to believe it was still possible.